Welcome, I'm Harold Holzer. I have the honor of serving as the director of Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb, I want to welcome you all here. It's so exciting to see an overflow crowd. I apologize to those who can't find seats. And before I do my introduction, I want to acknowledge the presence of our Eleanor Roosevelt Distinguished Leader in Residence and our longtime Congresswoman, Carolyn Maloney. Well, I like to remind people always that right upstairs, the New Deal was calibrated by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the library that we now use as kind of a green room, and I was telling our special guest about that. And one of the things they discussed upstairs was the formation of what we now call an infrastructure policy, the WPA. And 70% of the new high schools that were built in the United States over the next 10 years were kind of cookie-cutter WPA high schools. And I know you are wondering why, of all issues that were created or addressed in this House, I bring up that. Well, that's because the high school that I ultimately went to, Bayside High School in Queens, another one, and my wife. But Richard Dreyfuss would have gone to that high school, would have graduated in my class, and he claims would have dated my wife. That's another story. But his parents dragged him off to California, so he was unable to join me as a classmate. But we'd made up for lost time and become friends. Now, the other thing I like to do at our programs, and I certainly want to acknowledge two of our board members who are here, Daniel Schuckman and Tony Stepansky, both of whom are being nice enough to not take seats in this crowded room. So welcome to you. But I also try to quote Eleanor when I can. And here is a perfect quote from one of her My Day columns in 1962, the last year that she wrote the daily column. We must know enough to understand the issues. We must learn not to be swayed by prejudice or even by the charm of a fine orator. I always wondered whether she's talking about her husband there. We must seek the facts, we must learn, and when we think we've sifted out the truth, we must have the courage to judge and stand by our convictions. This requires of us more than just going to the polls on election day. It requires understanding of what our two-party system presents us in the way of principles. That statement could have been part of Richard Dreyfuss's new book on civics education. It's called One Thought Scares Me. We teach our children what we wish them to know. We don't teach our children what we don't wish them to know. And inside, indeed, is a treatise on what is scaring Richard Dreyfuss, namely the decline of civic education, citizen awareness, and educated comprehension in a kind of a technology-suffused society. Anyway, I'm really thrilled to have him back at Roosevelt House. It's his second appearance, his first in the auditorium. His biography, in brief, is in your programs, of course. And I think what makes him special is that we all feel that we know him well, right? He's been part of our lives for 50 years, those of us old enough to remember back that far. The unforgettable star of American Graffiti and Jaws and Close Encounters and The Goodbye Girl, for which he won the Oscar, of course. What About Bob? I always put in my favorites when I do the litany. And Mr. Holland, of course, and has in recent years played non-fictional characters, people like Haldeman, Cheney, and even Bernie Madoff. But so the range is extraordinary. He and I have done Lincoln and Ulysses Grant programs across the country, at the Metropolitan Museum, at the Library of Congress, and cities around the continent, and he always dazzles me as much, not only with his talent, but with his commitment, his understanding of history, and his commitment to just the need for learning and understanding. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And then you can decide whether he's more like Roy Neary, building hillsides out of compost because he's about to meet the other side of the world in Close Encounters, or more like Mr. Holland, hearing a grand opus that we all need to listen to. Maybe he's both. So please welcome my friend Richard Dreyfuss. So explain the long subtitle to us. It's unusual, except for Oh Dad, Poor Dad, etc.
It was either that title or The Return to Common Senselessness. And at the last minute, this won out, because it says explicitly that we have decided not to pick up the torch that has been handed to every generation since the Constitutional Convention. Everyone has picked it up and passed it on. And it's part of our heritage, it's part of our DNA, it's part of our present life, it's part of our past, and it should be as much a part of our future. And without it, we are about as unique as a herd of antelope. And we're not in any way special. We have been, and we conceived of a government that was not only special, but beautiful in its expectations of what man was capable of. And they didn't kid around about it. They turned the power of the monarch over to the people. And if you ask a legal scholar who has the power in America, they're going to say, well, the phrase, we, the people, answers that question. We, the people, have the power of the monarch and the sovereign. And without that explicit thing that we fired the king for fraud and we allowed the aristocracy to fade away, and we handed the responsibility of America, both now and in the future, to the most common of all people. And we expected, and we're true to it, we expected that we would ride herd over that promise. And we did until 1971 or 2, when we just decided for the first time that we were arrogant and stupid enough to declare ourselves smarter than the founders.
Let me ask you a question, because of the big it that we're talking about. So I was reminiscing and joking a little bit about our near high school experience, but we both went to high school around the same time. I in Queens and you in Beverly Hills, just to rub that in one more time. But what were we learning in grade school and again in high school that children are not learning now? What is the it?
Well, the main it is that we have the power of the ruler. We have what the Sun King was taught by, I would say, probably 100 special tutors. We were, we taught ourselves and taught our immigrant future how to use our brain, use our vocabulary, learn the difference between clarity of thought and chaos, and we were the first, actually, the first generation of humans to bother to educate the poorest of the poor and everyone else. We are the first because no other government of any kind, whether it be an empire or a country or whatever, ever bothered to teach anyone how to read, how to write, how to do sums, and they were to be treated very much like cattle. And that's what they were good for. And they were, if someone decided to sneak onto the king's land and shoot a deer because he and his family had nothing to eat, and he was caught in the process, not only did he have no right to do such a thing, he was killed for it, or dismembered, or disgraced. Not just disgraced, he bled. And that's every country in every continent for 5,000 years. There's no one who broke that arrangement. The monarchs thought that it was a very good fit, that if people had a function, it was to please the monarch and nothing else. And there were people who, for instance, had done a king a favor in the past, and his descendants were constantly being rewarded for that act hundreds and hundreds of years later, when no one even remembered what it was that they had done. And it was based upon an unfairness and a lack of empathy that was so enormous that to be human meant really to be in a constant state of pain.
But you're talking about history now, and I know the main focus is civics education, the main focus in the book. Your focuses are broad and wide and deep. But in terms of the educated electorate aspect of your argument and your concern, we were taught, right? We were taught local government in 4th grade in Queens, and then we were taught national government, and we were taught the branches of government and essentials that, according to political surveys, are extraordinarily lacking in the consciousness of young Americans today. College level, not at Hunter College, but college-age kids. Hunter College know their stuff. I just led a Hunter College group to Gettysburg, and they prepared and they knew what those people were fighting for and against. But it's kind of a lost generation, right, of students who don't know how their government works. And essentially don't care because there are other things online. Anyway, I don't know where the question is there.
Well,
but
it's a fascinating thing that no government ever thought of itself as caring a rat's ass for the welfare of the people. That was not in their job description. The monarch was not there to fulfill the expectations of the people. He was there to be fed well and to have sex with as many women as possible so that he could have a male heir. There was very little else going on in the life of a monarch, and he had what they call sovereign power. And at that moment, there was really, by coincidence, a philosophy being born and expounded upon called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the acceptance of the idea that humanity lived in total darkness, total and complete darkness, intellectual ignorance that was enforced by military. It was enforced by the king and his cohorts because they had the money. They had the money to hire a domestic army to keep their people in line.
So how can we be in darkness now if there's so much light? Meaning the internet. You talk in the book about several different iterations of communications revolution. You talk about Sarnoff and the creation of networks that had in mind further enlightenment. The paradox that comes out in the book and in your discussions of this, moving beyond the monarchical period into now, is this paradox of having so much information available at the fingertip, I guess, and yet the knowledge not being absorbed or shared.
Well,
I mean, how do we deal with it in the future? I mean, assuming we are
we know one thing. We know that teaching is not just the giving over of information. Teaching is also guidance and wisdom, and it's knowing how to collect information and collect the life experience of mankind and to give it to our children so that they have some understanding of what the experience has been that has led people to the Enlightenment. People are constantly valuing teachers incorrectly. Teachers are, as you know, the ones who, more than anyone else, except perhaps an enlightened parent, who are the ones who shape the moral character of our children. And yet we treat them with a contempt that is stupid and ugly and misplaced. We pay them as we pay kitchen help, and we accuse them publicly of being sly, lying cheaters. And if you give it any thought at all, you know that teachers are incomparable, and they are, without any doubt, the ones that are most valuable to the inclusion, to creating a civil society. And if you don't have teachers that support that, you've got nothing but doom to look forward to. And right now, we happen to be at what I call an end game. We are playing an end game with America. And the United States of America may very well exist as a nation past 2050 or 2075, but in no way will it live as America, as the place that is the spiritual home of intellectual freedom and liberty and responsible adulthood and the change, or let's put it this way, the secular version of what we always separate as theology, we put into practice in a secular story everything that has ever been considered a spiritually progressive idea. We put it into reality, and we have to learn it just as we have to learn the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments is not something that you get in the bloodline, and it's not something you get from a revelatory experience. You get it by it being taught and taught and taught and taught again. And that's why your family would take you every Sunday to a minister or a rabbi, and you would get it again. And civics is the one subject that you should be taking every year in every class, not just from ninth grade to 12th grade, but let's say from kindergarten on, and in every class. You take a biology class, you're also taking civics. In a class that that is about advanced mathematics, you have to learn civics. Not only do you have to learn a civil dialogue, a manner in which we can discuss these things without turning into screaming, yelling, ridiculous children, but we have to be the adult we aim for. And when we wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and such things, we actually said to the world, this is who we wish to be. And many of us said, this is who we wish to be when we grow up. And that is still the remarkable aspect of our government. It is meant to be generous and benevolent and fair and balanced, and you learn what is you are responsible for, what you are accountable for, and you should learn it with pride, because it's the largest step forward in moral progress in the history of the human race. And I don't care whether you are a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative or a liberal. I'm talking about taking responsibility for the authority to run a government and do it well. And that's what we have been trying to do until the 70s, when we just threw it all away.
What happened in the 70s, aside from cynicism, post-war cynicism? How did civics get lost as a requirement? I'm interested in the fact that you pinpointed to a certain moment.
Yeah, this question has befuddled me for a long, long time. What was it that happened? And I basically say that it was the James Dean generation. And what I mean is, my older brothers and cousins were too young to help their fathers in World War II, and too old to take acid with me. And the difference of those two experiences is vast. And they were the first generation born in America, or destined to be American, who had to overcome the fact that they were without mission. They were without any reason. They had no place to put themselves. Every other generation that has ever been in America has been connected to the America of their present. And then in the 20th century, when the world was turning its back on people and things that offered balance and sanity, and were openly choosing the worst kind of behavior, we had two things happen. One was the Great Depression, and the other was the dictators in Europe. And when the Great Depression happened, it tested us in a way that we have never been tested, even up to and including the Civil War, which was 700,000 dead. 700,000 people died basically for two ideas: union and slavery. Union and making sure that slavery did not exist in the present world, or else we had nothing but shame to carry. And so we killed 700,000 men in order to support our sense of rightness and goodness. And that took a lot out of us. And the next thing that happened was the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was very depressing. And before that could be cured or turned around, we were in a war with one guy, basically, who was kind enough to write a book, who said exactly what he intended. He was clear enough to say, I'm going to rid the world of all the Jews and all the gypsies and all of this and all of that, and I am going to turn the world back to the 6th century. And because he wrote that book, and because people in those days actually learned things when they went to school, my father and his generation knew exactly who they were fighting and why. They didn't kid around. And my father, who was the leader of the Jewish gang in Brooklyn before the war and was used to a world of violence, volunteered to go to Europe because Adolf Hitler was this close to winning our future, taking it from us and turning it into his. And you cannot imagine how horrible that would have been. You cannot. And so I applaud my father and all of his friends for saving our ass from that. And as soon as that was over, everyone began to imitate us because we had the magic formula, we had the recipe, we were great, and we were. And all of Eastern Europe and all of modern Western Europe began to imitate, turn their governments into imitations of ours. And then we got to the 60s. And the 60s, how do you put this? I once wrote a cartoon about this, and it was a boy seeing his father drive erratically towards the house, and he knew his father was drunk. So he tries to clean him up a little bit before mom sees him. And they get into a terrible fight. Terrible. And then they forget what they were fighting over, but they're just fighting. And that's what happened in America. We fought our generations over everything, from drugs to sex to, while we were having a progress in achieving pills that prevented pregnancy, we were also having a knockdown, drag-out fight over the right to have sex. And it was a confusing and terribly strange time. And at the same time, magic appeared. All of a sudden, there was a television in your living room, and a television that delivered images and people that were as magical as a magic carpet. You didn't need to have a babysitter. All you needed was a TV. And that TV changed us all. It changed us in how it killed rumination and contemplation It killed thinking things through. We didn't know this at the time, but when we look back, that's what had happened. We watched I Love Lucy, and we watched the Army McCarthy hearings. And what we realized was that while we were watching those two things, we had to go to the bathroom. And we kept it in until the commercial. And that's when every toilet in America got flushed. And that's when they knew, wow, this has had an effect we didn't expect. And I'm telling you, that at that time was fantastic. It was great. No, it wasn't. Because at that time they were inventing advertising. And what happened to our families was pretty violent. And when my older brothers grew up and they knew that they were without that mission that their father had had, why were they so lost and barren? And like James Dean, and see the movie, because the movie Rebel Without a Cause is exactly about this problem. It's about this, and you should see it, because we watched that film for only one reason, and that's James Dean died. But if you watch it for its content, you will see that it's about these kids who have no moral guide. And he's constantly screaming, "You're tearing me apart. I don't know which way to go." And they didn't. And finally, when they grew up, they grew through the 60s. And the 60s meant the Democratic Convention of 1968. And that meant watching the mayor of Chicago say on American television, "Fuck you," and watching the Chicago cops beat kids who were wearing funny clothes. And all of that was something that meant chaos and defeat. We forgot that we had been raised by a generation of the authors of the Constitution to seek out not a passive public, but a participatory citizenship. A participatory citizenship. And when we got there, we said the worst thing in the world is the participatory citizenship that you want us to be. And so then they joined school boards in 1971 and immediately stopped anything that meant a participation as a citizen. And our schooling changed from aiming for the goal of participation and becoming again the passive public that all monarchs had had for all those thousands of years.
So you'll see there's history and sociology in the argument, psychology, dislocation. Okay, we're not going to let ourselves get depressed because we'll get to solutions. But I want to make sure that within our usual constraint, which is kind of flying by here, that we give you an opportunity to ask questions. So we're going to do that earlier than usual so that you can have a dialogue, you can enter the dialogue too. So, okay. Well, Mac, you have the mic. Well, we'll start back here.
Richard,
let's keep them brief and
very brief.
so we can do as many as
us,
possible.
Can you tell us with more specificity what your civics initiative is actually up to?
Yeah. My civics initiative is to revive the study of the Constitution around the fourth grade and keep at it constantly. It's the study of the Constitution as a document. It's the study of the Bill of Rights and the reasons why the first 10 amendments are placed within the Constitution and are not held out. It's the reason why the public is meant to be as knowledgeable as possible, because they were out to create resource pools of intellect so that you were smart enough after the 12th grade to run the government or any other endeavor that you wanted, that you were free to choose your career path, and that no one had the right to tell you, insist on telling you what you could or couldn't do.
So go online and look up the Dreyfuss Initiative, by the way.
And also understand that there are words that we take for granted now, such as opportunity, that did not exist in the real world. We invented the opportunity to have opportunity.
Do you think that, in particular to the Second Amendment, do you think that the reason there's such debate is because there's a lot of misinterpretation or misreading of the Second Amendment, and it's not been studied properly and not been carefully understood, and that's one of the reasons why we have such a conflict about it?
I think one of the main reasons is that it's badly written. The Second Amendment is the only amendment which is written poorly, and it does not give you any clarity at all. And it was written at a time when certain words meant certain things, such as militia. When they say that it was God-given right to have a militia, that word was meant not completely, but for most Americans, as the word given to slave owners during a slave uprising, and they were allowed to have their guns so that they could kill their slaves. And that was it. It was never meant, obviously, to be a total defense of slavery. It was meant to defend the slave owners' right to defend their families when the slaves rose, which they knew they would do. So.
Okay. I haven't looked at this side yet. Well, that's because there are no questions, no hands. Oh, Joe, go ahead. Sorry.
I think one of the most important things in the study of civics, especially having it done today, is making sure the children understand the debates that went on during the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers. Because what we have today with what's going on is the amount of the lack of debate that we have, the cancel culture, which I think is a result of what you've discussed in the 70s, that now there's a lot of people who believe there's only one way of doing things, and that you can't have debate, and people on campuses are not allowed to talk, and you get thrown out. Do you look at this, and do you look at your initiative of making sure that people understand that you can have a debate, and it's a good thing? You don't have to believe in both sides, but you ultimately have to come to some kind of consensus.
Anyone who believes that there is only one opinion is natively an idiot. And what we support and say in the Constitution we support is the debate between opinions, and that all opinions are valid, and you sometimes duke it out militarily, or you allow debate by our representatives. But sooner or later, someone wins and loses a debate, and you have to stick with it. And there have been, in the last 40 years, attempts by parents to come into public schools and say, I don't want my children exposed to opposing views. And there have been principals who are dumb enough to cancel debate because of that parent. And parents should learn that this government, more than most, but this government is not alone in using words like trust and risk, which we never hear about anymore. But if someone came into my school, and I was a teacher of history, and they were saying, we don't want any debate, I would say, thank you very much for your opinion. Get out. And don't interfere with what we do here until 3 o'clock. And then you can come in and say what you want.
Right back here, in the back.
Hi, this is just a comment. I'm so glad I made it here, and I'm so glad I finally met you. You've been on my mind since 1977, between October and December, and a lot has changed on my end since then. So glad.
Thank you.
Right here in the aisle, and then we'll come down to the front.
Thank you for your wonderful acting and for your civics initiative. My question is, I've only just started your book and it's wonderful. How did you get interested in civics? And secondly, what do you think the best way is to teach civics? Is it partly through movies or videos, or what's the best way?
How did you get interested first?
First of all, I come from a very political family. My great aunt assassinated Tsar Alexander in 1881. So
This is true. It's not
Yes.
hyperbolic. It's
my family popped the Tsar, and everyone else, including Alexander Lenin, Nikolai Lenin's brother, was hung, and my great aunt was not, because she was pregnant, and even the Okhrana did not kill pregnant women. And so she came to America, and she went into Ellis Island as Helsia Helfman and came out Elsie Hoffman. And my grandmother was also Elsie Hoffman, and she was a witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Yes. And she saw 154 girls try to jump from life into divinity and lose and drop dead at my grandmother's feet. And she turned around and joined the Socialist Party and ultimately became Eugene Debs' private secretary. And so I have a family that has a lean towards such things. And I see my grandmother quite often in crowds like this. And as a matter of fact, she's sitting right over there. And she gave me a very clear moral understanding.
What about the question of what media can be used to impart civics knowledge? I thought that was an interesting part of the question.
It's interesting. I have a chapter in this book which is all about solutions, what you can do to help this. It's not a simple thing, but you have to understand a lot of complexities. For instance, the only reason for public schools was to teach civics. That was the reason to have public schools. And civics meant that you were taught other methods of communication other than what comes naturally, which is yelling, screaming, and interrupting. And when you allow that only to be the way that you communicate, you're obviously going to fail in your communication of what you think or your assumption of what the other person is thinking. And that's why to learn civics, you had to learn it, and you had to learn it in a manner that was acceptable to all sides, and you could not have a bias. There's a guy on the Wall Street Journal who is their civics guy, quote unquote, and he said that liberals have a hidden agenda in teaching civics. And I said, oh, poo. And I said, I'm going to make you famous. So join me and we'll duke this out. Are you saying that you don't want civics taught to our young? And there was a very long silence. And then he said, no, I'm not saying that. I said, stop right there. Teach it. Risk it. Risk the hidden agenda of your opponent. Risk it. They've been risking that since 1787. What makes you think that you're smarter than they are? And they're not. And they can't be treated as such.
You've been very patient, so I'm going to let you ask your question.
Thank you. I have a son in the 20s, and he lives in Philadelphia. And just today, he complained to me that none of his friends like to read. My son is a history buff, and he reads everything. But he says, he wants to lend his friends or have discussions, and none of them like to read. How do you even approach that?
Well, that's mainly due to bad teaching and people accepting a very low bar for the people who want to be teachers. And there are ways of igniting excitement in people. It depends on what it is. I have friends who are turned on completely by advanced mathematics and only in advanced mathematics and in advanced music can you see how those two things wrap themselves around someone's intellect. And you can't know that until you get there. Or in history, you have to know in history that everyone who lives here in America, everyone, came from somewhere worse. And that's no joke. Everyone here came from somewhere worse. Imagine how bad that was, because they had no alternatives. They came here because they had to. They came here because they had no options left. And if you broke a law or broke a deal or got on the wrong side of the king, a lot of different things could happen to you, but the most likely thing would be that they would chop your nose off. And they did on a regular basis for 6,000 years. They chopped your nose off. So there was an industry of nose choppers and an industry of people who taught nose choppers how to build fake noses. And everyone had fake noses. And that's for real until us. We were the first government in the history of the human race to not only outlaw things like chopped noses, but to actually think of the welfare of the people. And that phrase, the welfare of the people, is in the, what do they call it? The not the preface, the
Preamble.
The preamble. And the preamble, there's a mythology about the preamble. People say they don't know. They don't really know who wrote it. It appeared there on the last day. Whether that's true or not, we know that it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do establish this Constitution." There's no government on earth that would have published that statement. And that statement is as bald and brazen and brave as any statement has ever been. And living up to that is what you owe your kids. And if you don't see that you are the ones that caused this to happen, you've got to rethink because you are the power in this country, and you let this happen. Let me tell you a quick story. When we had a revolution, it was the biggest noise in the world. Everyone knew about it. Every sovereign in the world was terrified by it. What we created here was a real threat to them. And everyone talked about one thing, and that was the revolution in America. But they took it away in complete secret. You have no idea when civics stopped being taught. I'll tell you, but it's so far away. It's so unknown. We don't know anything. No one asked us. Did anyone ever say to you, let's have a debate about keeping civics? Did anyone ever do? No. And that's theft. And that's a counter-revolution. And that's a coup d'etat. And we've had it. We've had a coup d'etat against us and our children, and we've decided that having an empire is more important than having an intellectual public. Those are your kids. Those are you. None of you had the civic education that I had, because I'm older than you are. I'm 75. Anyone here? Okay, there you go. So you had it. No one else had it. People think that they had civics because they had a class called civics. You don't learn civics in that manner, and you don't learn civics as separate and apart. The whole thing has been taken and based on their absolute faith that we are as dumb as ducks. And the reason I wrote this book is to remind you that you're not as dumb as ducks, that you are not anything to be diminished by. You are as smart as they were then and will need in the future. You've just got to do it. You have to take control of what you are in control of. You have to remind people that you are the sovereign power in America. We have somehow twisted something around that we vote for some people for Congress, and then when they're voted in, they somehow become our boss. They're not our boss. They are our servants, public servants. And if they don't do what we ask them to do, if they don't constantly ask us, what is it that you need or want? If they don't do that, fire their ass and get rid of them and take over the government that they took from us. I'm not joking, and I'm not asking for a revolution. I'm asking for a participatory citizenship.
And an educated next generation.
Yeah. We have to take it.
And I think these folks have come up with some really interesting ideas about using different platforms. If your son's friends don't read, there are other ways they can learn. I mean, there are other ways. There are debates. There are
bribes. You know, you have a contest and give one kid who reads better than the others,
Bribes are
a
good.
reward like money.
I still think we would have had a more educated citizenry if we had had 3 more seasons of Max Bickford. Right, David? That's a joke, but you may all know of that show. Daniel, do you have a question?
You speak of the Constitution with such reverence and honor and aspiration. And I guess one theme that you haven't really touched on, though, in all your comments is whether and how it's being taught. I mean, I'll just tell you, having kids who just went through a fancy private school here, civics is being taught, Constitution is being taught. It's not being taught with the reverence that you speak of it as, and it's being taught as a very different document. Not just that it had flaws, but that it was not inherently benign or aspirational or a outcome of the Enlightenment or something to be improved upon. And so, discuss.
The Constitution of the United States is a moral achievement. It can't be compared to anything else, and it is the product of people of their own generation and of their own bias and their own problems. Yes, and they didn't anticipate a lot of things that they should have, but in terms of what their intent was and what their promise was, that the public itself would have no obstacles between them and learning anything, that's real. And you may have, yes, been creating the Constitution at the same time that you're accepting slavery in the southern half of America, but that was a problem to them and us, and that's why we had to fight a war about it. People were not happy or in harmony with the document as it was published. And that's why is it something that can be changed, or is it something that must never be changed? And I think that that's a question that should be debated forever, and I think it's something that you must change. It changes with us as we change.
But that's a scary thing to leave us with, but I think because of our time constraints, we're going to have to move it upstairs. I will say one thing about the Constitution and about our students here at Hunter. And I mentioned that we took some students to Gettysburg. Last week, 17 Hunter students who have internships under one of our scholarship programs here went to Washington and got to sit in the galleries of the United States Senate as the Senate voted for the first time on whether the Equal Rights Amendment is part of the Constitution or not. And it was kind of hard to follow because there were no senators in the room. They came and went. Our great Carolyn Maloney was there talking to the students. They didn't understand why people go in and do like this or like this, but they saw a majority of senators say that not a bulletproof majority because there was a filibuster in place, one of those filibusters that don't actually happen, but they're implied. But they saw 52 senators, an outright majority, say that the Constitution is more perfect than it was 50 years ago. It was kind of thrilling, and our students were there. That's what makes Hunter so great. And that's what makes all of you so great. Thanks for coming. See you upstairs.
Hold it. Whoa. One more thing. The reason I'm not smiling and happy and telling you a lot of jokes is because I feel threatened by the absence of the Constitution, and I feel that we are headed in that direction, and we must do something about it. I'm not happy. I am not unafraid. I am terrified at the absence of the Constitution. I am terrified that we are right now making up our knowledge of our own government, and we have no such reason to be calm and benign about it. If we don't have the Constitution, we have nothing. Because George Washington said that the Constitution must always be central, and the factions, the parties, must always be peripheral. And we now live in an opposite world from that. And we think our parties are more important than the Constitution. And that is the victory of the ignorant and the victory of the malicious.